Cool. All right. Okay, I'm here with Ari, or see if I can get this right. Xiaoma. Is that right?
Xiaoma, exactly.
Xiaoma,
Yeah, yeah,
NYC.
yeah.
You gave me a little bit of
You have great,
coaching.
you have great tones in Chinese, Ali.
It probably comes from the Cantonese, I think. But
Okay.
for the benefit of people listening, you gave me a little bit of spot coaching on the pronunciation of that word before we started. So good to talk to you, man. How's life?
Likewise. Yeah, having fun in quarantine, to
Yeah,
the
aren't
to
we
the
all?
best of my abilities. Yeah, no, but otherwise great. I mean, I've been spending most of this time in quarantine, learning Spanish, actually. Um, and because for me it's been a while since I've really tried and learned another language. I speak Mandarin very well. I speak a little bit of Cantonese and some Fujonese, but it's been a while since I really tried learning another language from a different language family. And
It's a different ball
uh,
game, isn't it?
yeah, it's a very different ball game. There's some very interesting things about learning Spanish after having spent so long learning Mandarin. Um,
Yeah. So I
and
want to get into that, but maybe for the benefit of people, of anyone out there who hasn't heard of you, who
Yep.
obviously doesn't use YouTube, do you want to give us like a little potted bio?
Yeah, so I make videos on the internet where I do a bunch of things, but at least before the quarantine, the main thing that I was doing was was essentially just like speaking in Chinese and seeing what happens, like what it's like for a white guy to speak in Chinese to Chinese people. Like what is that like, right? Like everybody's had, like every person in, most people in Western society. Hello, just kind of froze
Yeah,
there.
yeah. I think my VPN just disconnected. Let's
Okay.
let's just go back to the bio thing and start that bit one more time. If
Okay.
that's all right. Just give me a let's
Sure.
click.
Yeah.
So for the benefit of anybody who doesn't know who you are, do you want to give us a quick potted bio, so just to fill us in?
Sure. Yeah. So I make videos on the internet, where what I do is, at least before the quarantine, what I was doing was, essentially showing the world, or at least the English speaking world, what it's like to interact with people, Chinese people, what it's like for somebody obviously non-Chinese to interact with Chinese people in their language or languages, because there are many different Chinese languages. And I think that for a lot of people it's like, it's funny because before making the videos, before starting to make these videos, for me it was like the most ordinary thing in the world to go and buy vegetables in the marketplace with Chinese. Like, I would just do that every day. I was like, all right, this is totally normal. But
And
but
that's
I
in
never.
China or in New York where you are now.
No, in New York, in New
Yeah.
York, yeah. And to get groceries in Chinese, like, what, it was like a daily thing for me. And I never thought that somebody on the internet might find that interesting or worth watching. But it turns out,
Turns out they do. Eh?
yeah, it turns out that there's a bunch of people who like find that interesting. And I think that like, I think that a lot of people are interested in knowing, well, okay, what's it like to order in a Chinese restaurant? Everybody's had that experience, right? But in Chinese, like, what is that like? Like, what would happen? And so, people can live vicariously through through those videos.
So that's how did this YouTube thing come about then? Was it always something that did you set out to do that? Was there an evolution? How do you see your kind of YouTube journey?
Yeah, I did a couple things before doing YouTube, but the thing that I was doing immediately prior to YouTube was software. And so I was working as a software engineer simultaneously with making videos on YouTube. And uh, I it was just kind of as a pastime. And at the time, I was mostly doing a Chinese language vlog. Like I was making videos in Chinese for mostly a Chinese speaking audience. Um, and at some point, like I had enough fans and enough runway to kind of think to myself like, why don't I try doing this full time? And so I took the plunge maybe like a couple years ago, and and yeah, and then the rest was kind of history.
So you're obviously coming at this as a Chinese, what do you call you? Chinese expert, very good Chinese speaker. Pick your
So well,
description.
for a non native speaker, but the amazing thing about Chinese is that the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. Like
Yeah.
it's really like a rabbit hole because I mean, Chinese speakers, like native speakers, go to schools in China growing up just memorizing reams of Chinese poetry, and the depth of cultural knowledge and experience that any given Chinese speaker can draw on in any conversation is immense. And so it's very difficult as a native speaker. Like for a non-native speaker, I'm really really good at Chinese, but compared to a native speaker, like there's so much I don't know. There's so much I don't know.
And do you consider that a linguistic thing or a cultural thing, or a bit of both?
It's it's both. It's both, but I think the larger part of it is cultural, because in a similar way to, because what I think happens in Chinese, I think the language embeds a lot of cultural assumptions that we don't really have in the West. Like, for example, people in your average conversation in Chinese will do the equivalent. They use a thing called chengyu, which are like 4-character classical Chinese idioms in daily speech, and regularly. And it's sort of the equivalent of in English if we pulled out quotations from Shakespeare on a daily basis to buttress our arguments in certain situations. But except everybody does that in China. Like it's a regular thing. And so, to get to that level is very difficult for non.
Yeah, so this is because I'm one of the things I enjoy doing most is when I'm talking to people who've got experience in languages that I don't know, is kind of compare the experience of those journeys. And I've often like thought about this dichotomy between Asian languages and European languages, and how are they different, how are they similar. And if I think about languages that I know to a kind of really high level, the experience is usually one of it getting easier over time.
Yeah.
You've got certain things to wrap your head around at the beginning, like verb tenses and funny conjugations and stuff like that. But if you take a Romance language, coming from an English perspective, learning a Romance language, usually the harder you get, the more cognates you find, because you've got these words with the same roots. And there comes a point in those languages where there's enough kind of common ground linguistically, but also culturally, that you don't really find these big communication gaps. So it's not the case that like, if I was to go and try and do something really difficult in Spanish, there might be some linguistic difficulties, but there's not much of a cultural gap, because it's the Spanish culture and English culture is it's fairly close. But I've often run up against this in Japanese, which I have a background in, where you just so often run up against these inexplicable kind of glass doors that you just run headfirst into, and you don't quite know why. And it's often because of these cultural gaps or assumptions or implications, things that are implied, which you have no idea are being implied because you don't have that cultural knowledge, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And I'll add another point to that, which is so I don't think I've mentioned yet that I've been learning Spanish, or maybe I did.
I think you mentioned it at the beginning, and looking forward to asking you about that.
maybe at the beginning, right? And so one really interesting thing with Spanish is that one thing I've noticed as I'm learning is that sometimes in English conversation I'll like to pull out a $10 word, or there's some kind of phrase that's like a difficult phrase, but that might capture the situation well. That's so easy to do in Spanish. It's the easiest freaking thing because the word is already, that word is it's the same Latin root.
Yeah.
Right? and so I can employ that really easily in Spanish with the exact same word. And to a Spanish speaker, that might sound like, whoa, how the shit did you do that?
Yeah.
But in English, you know, but no, it's not, because it's the same freaking word in English, right?
There's so much that transfers, isn't there, from English to the, whereas with the kind of converse of what I said before about Romance languages is that with Asian languages, often I find like the more advanced you get, it just doesn't get any easier. It gets harder and harder because there's all this stuff that you still don't know, like whether it's Chinese characters or words or whatever.
The difficulty, right? It's not like an exponentially easier learning curve. It's a linear learning curve, because the more you learning more doesn't make it any easier to continue learning. Like, you still have to, all this there's so much vocabulary. Like, if you had to, the equivalent in Spanish would be like, I think actually I learned this figure from you, but what, 50% of Spanish vocabulary is cognate with English? Okay. Yeah. Right? More maybe? I don't know. But especially when you add the scientific terms, you probably get because there's so many scientific terms that we borrow so easily into English, you know, that's like, and then we have a core of 1,000 or 2,000 Anglo-Saxon words. So we have probably the majority of the corpus of English words have some cognate in Spanish, like when you throw in all the scientific words and stuff like that. Well, in Chinese, that's 0%.
Yeah.
You know, and you have literally there's like a list on Wikipedia of 100 words that English takes from Chinese.
Everything has to be learned from scratch, right?
Everything's learned from scratch. You know, and so, well, and throw in the fact that the fun part about Chinese is that every single word you have to learn a new mini micro picture for. So, you know, you can't say if somebody says something, you're like, huh, okay, well, what did they say? Can you tell me how to write that? Well, even if you know how to write the pinyin, it doesn't necessarily you need to know the character, right? So, So yeah, it doesn't I've been trying to get through a book in Chinese recently, and it's not easy. You know, I've been spending a long time learning Chinese, and reading a book is still hard. It's difficult. You know, there's so much of the vocabulary. It's just what is this?
Let me ask you this: to get to and it's a very interesting point that of so from a Western non-Chinese speaking perspective, you know, as you said, it's easy to kind of look at your Chinese and think, oh man, that's a huge pedestal, right? And then but you know yourself that there's so much more yet to study. So I'm kind of, you know, cautious of talking in these terms. But to get to the level that you have, which is phenomenal, what has it in a kind of very general terms, what has that process looked like? Has it been one really long, hard slog for years on end? Or has it been a kind of meander, or how would you characterize the experience of getting to where you have with Chinese?
Right. Well, the first thing that I'll say is you know, we were just talking about how difficult Chinese was, and that is true, but at the same time, you don't need a native level of ability in or knowledge of Chinese to be able to have a conversation with people in Chinese where you can talk about just about everything. You know, I consider myself fluent in Chinese to the point where I can talk about pretty much whatever I want to talk about with another native speaker without any problems. And the only I'm not actively trying to increase my knowledge of Chinese at this point, because there's really diminishing marginal returns, right? I could, if I really tried aggressively, maybe I could get to the level where I could really comfortably read a book in Chinese like I can with English, but it would take so much to get to that level, and the reward wouldn't really be there, right? So I would say that to get to the level where you can speak, where you can have a really fluent conversation in Chinese with somebody, actually isn't really as hard as a lot of people would think. I think that if you spend maybe a year of just really focusing on conversations and a year of learning vocabulary and, you know, preferably, you know, living in a Chinese speaking part of the world, you can get to a pretty solid level of conversation, you know, without being native by any stretch of the imagination. But, you know, I think that's, for me anyway, that's That's the level I'm comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when you mentioned that, preferably in a Chinese speaking environment, I was trying to imagine myself learning Cantonese or learning Japanese without being in or having lived in that environment for a while, and
Sure.
I can't picture it because it comes back to what we were saying before about
Yeah.
that cultural knowledge, right? There is, I mean, just in the case of, I mean, Japanese is, I think this is probably more the case than in Mandarin, but there's just so much with Japanese where if you get your body language wrong, and if you go and talk to somebody with the
Hmm.
wrong, slightly too assertively, like you've kind of like,
Yeah.
it's like you can really torpedo
Oh,
the interaction if you don't, if you're not able to take the temperature of a particular moment or whatever.
right.
So that's obviously a big part, isn't it? I mean, what would you do if you were going to do that? What would you say to someone who's learning Chinese from
Yeah.
abroad, from home?
Right.
How would they get a handle on that
Yeah.
culturally?
So I would say actually based so I would say from what I've heard, um, with respect to Japanese and Chinese and Korean relative to Chinese, I don't think Chinese has that same level of Chinese spoken Chinese doesn't really have that hierarchical structuring that Korean and Japanese do. Um, and I feel like, especially in spoken Chinese tends to be very informal. Even it's with maybe the exception of like high level business meetings, but in general, it's very informal.
You see, is that a
And
language thing? Is that a language thing or a cultural thing?
uh, it's a cultural thing
Yeah.
because Chinese used to be the Chinese language used to be in classical Chinese. It actually used to be very hierarchical. For example, when a subject was speaking with his king, the ruler, there's different pronouns that you would use in classical Chinese for addressing different levels of subjects. Like Chinese used to be much more hierarchical than it is now. But all of that changed post the end of the I mean I'm not really a scholar of Chinese history, but my suspicion is that it's that kind of came after the fall of the Chinese Empire, right? When you no longer had these Chinese dynasties with the empire and what happened and especially post communism. I mean, post communism, like you weren't allowed to speak to another as if they weren't your equal, right? So I think that
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think that communism helped enforce a lot of that. Although that's not necessarily true, right? Because I mean, it's not necessarily solely due to that reason. Because if you look at like Hong Kong or Taiwan, which didn't have similar experiences of communism, those societies still do not have high levels of formality in speech. Um, but
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking
uh,
in terms of like just if you were going to caricature the
right,
Japanese versus the Chinese,
yeah,
then they're fairly kind of polar. It seemed to me, to my uneducated
yeah,
eye, to be the fairly polar opposite in the sense that
right,
you don't, Chinese are like there's no beating around the bush. You kind of get in someone's
yeah,
face and say what you want.
mhm,
Whereas with Japanese people, it's the complete opposite, where there's this whole
right,
kind of dance that's done before you actually get to the
yeah.
point.
It's so true, and I don't know what like people are super direct in Chinese, and I don't know why I don't know why that's the case or why why Japanese is so tends to I mean it has to be something cultural, right? But
Yeah, I mean,
but I
people I know from Hong Kong are always making fun of me for being so English and being too polite and not, avoiding conflict and stuff like that.
yeah.
And so
Well, hey, I mean, Canada is very different culturally from the U.S. in this respect, right? Where Canadians tend to be like a lot more polite and less direct in speech, and more Japanese in their attitude, whereas Americans in general take like a more Chinese approach.
yeah,
But I would say that for that reason, I think it's actually very easy to learn Chinese from home. I'm spending right now. I'm spending so much time learning Spanish, but it's been all from my apartment, you
yeah,
know? And like I've gotten to a level right now where like I can have conversations in Spanish, which is super cool, but it's all been from my home. And I don't see I don't see any reason why you couldn't necessarily do that in Mandarin. I mean, it's going to be a little more difficult than Spanish for sure, but for English speakers,
Yeah, I guess there's
but
this in
yeah.
in the sense that if you're kind of just forming a base, and then you take the view that okay, your job from home is to form a foundation, a core of vocabulary and
Yep.
working knowledge of the language, and then you kind of go out into the real world, and you what's the thing, you take the test, you pass your driving test, and then you learn to drive, sort of thing.
Hmm.
That would hold true. Let's talk about Spanish then. So you've
Yes.
what's it like to spend so long on Mandarin, and go so
Yeah.
deep into the language, and then to switch to a totally different language?
Right. Yeah, it's bizarre. It's really bizarre. Because I think one very nice thing about learning Spanish is how much easier it is to learn in so many ways than there are definitely things about Spanish that are more difficult than Mandarin that I wish, like, oh my God, why does Spanish have to do it like this? Like, this is so dumb. Like, just do it
Is
like
it verbs by any
like,
chance?
yeah, right. Verbs, and just like 50% of the grammar. Like, so much time, I'm just like, there's no need to do it like this. But that's a complaint you can make with any language, right? Like, every language has all this like cruft that's just built up over history. You're just like, there's no reason to do it like this. Like, I could make a language that's way easier to learn and use than this one.
Esperanto.
But what?
Esperanto.
Yeah, Esperanto, or right.
Yeah.
Um,
So would it be would it be simplistic to say that Spanish, you're finding Spanish easy?
No, I'm not. Because I think that learning any language, like learning to have a real conversation in any language is not easy for anybody. I mean, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But I am pleasantly surprised by how much like I've become accustomed to not being able to do in Chinese that I can all of a sudden do in Spanish.
Yeah.
So, for example, Google Translate, right, is not useless with Chinese, but like compared to Spanish is practically useless. Like, it's been amazing to me how I can just type something in English into like Google Translate and get something like reasonably accurate out on the other end into Spanish.
It's pretty
like,
good. It's pretty
wow, that's
Yeah.
crazy. That's so useful. Like, I can have a computer talk to me in Spanish, and that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Another crazy thing is how I can just hear what somebody says and be able to write down with some rough accuracy, even as a beginner, what they've said.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like you said something, 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 and I'm like, huh, did you mean something, something, something? And they're like, yes, you did mean that. And I'm like, wow, that's great. It's what having an alphabet is great.
And
Magical.
also being a fairly phonetic language. I mean, what you hear is what you get in
Yes,
Spanish, right?
right. Mhm,
Whereas,
exactly,
I mean,
right. Like English or French,
Yeah, or I'm thinking particularly one of the things I struggled with in Cantonese, for example, is
Yeah.
things
Oh
like.
my God, Cantonese. Don't even get me started with that one.
I mean, funny enough, with Cantonese, I didn't have too many problems with the tones. I think maybe because I
Yeah.
have a background in music, so my
Uh-huh.
ear was kind of there from the beginning. I found vowels in particular a real challenge with Cantonese, because I couldn't distinguish between longer sounds and shorter sounds. Like, is it leng or leng? And when people are speaking quickly, I can't distinguish between those like vowel lengths. And often it's like I would hear an a, but it's actually an and it's like kind of like, and little sounds like ch, like the hard ch that you don't get in English. I had real problem. I couldn't hear a lot of stuff. Whereas with with Spanish, it is literally. I mean, it's fast, and people in Spain in particular speak very fast, right? But it's still phonetic in the sense that you can pretty much parse apart those individual sounds and know what you're dealing with.
Well, I wouldn't say that Cantonese isn't phonetic. Like, I mean, certainly there are alphabets with like you can write Cantonese, in I forget the name of it, like the Yale transcription, like Jitpin or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, you can write Cantonese perfectly fine. It's just that I think for Western ears, the sounds are very unfamiliar, and it takes a while, especially when people are speaking quickly, to be able to try and figure out what they're saying.
And it's an approximate. It's a big approximation as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure, right, exactly. And I have had some experience studying Korean, not very much, just like a little bit, but but I had that same problem in Korean, where the some of the sounds, like I would be trying to talk with my tutors, and they'd be trying to explain to me what the sound they were trying to make was, and writing it with English letters, but it really wasn't the same, and I got the sense that it wasn't the same, and there was some difference, but like BBAL didn't really capture like the sound that Korean speakers were making.
Yeah.
And yeah, it took a while to really kind of get that.
So let me ask you about the actual learning process, then moving to Spanish, because so I had a funny experience. One of the kind of formative experiences in my own language learning was that I'd begun with a number of European Romance languages.
Yeah.
So Spanish and French and Portuguese, and to a certain extent, one kind of rolled into the other, which is that once you've learnt one Romance language, the second is easier, and the third is way easier, and so on.
Yeah.
And I think I had I kind of thought to myself that, okay, I know how to learn languages now because I picked up quite a few like this.
Yeah.
And then I arrived in Japan, and none of the stuff that I was doing to learn the Romance language worked anymore. It's like I had to rediscover how to learn languages for a very different language to one that I was already familiar with, and it was quite a funny experience. Like having this, knowing that I was fairly good at languages, but then really struggling against this kind of this new phenomenon. So, I mean, I know you've learned a few kind of varieties of Chinese, right? So it's not like you've just learned the one language and that's it. But how have you approached? Did you go into Spanish thinking, okay, I know how to learn a language, and then that thought kind of held true as you began to learn the language, or have you had to do some rediscovery of language learning methodology?
Yeah, I would say the latter. Okay. So I actually started trying to learn Spanish. This was for a video, but it was kind of So one thing that I did with Chinese was I lived in China for a year, back in 2009 or something, and I spent a lot of time when I was in China memorizing vocabulary with Anki, just memorizing tons and tons of vocabulary, kind of based on what this guy. Have you heard of a website alljapaneseallthetime.com?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Seen it? Yeah, right. So wonderful website. I mean, I got so much inspiration from that dude, and so one of his big things was like Anki and memorizing vocabulary. So I spent tons of time in China memorizing vocabulary, and so when I started learning Spanish, I was like, hey, how's about this? I know no Spanish. Let's try memorizing the dictionary in Spanish and seeing what happened. So I started with 2,500 words. I was like, all right, let me try memorizing 2,500 words in Anki with no prior knowledge of any Spanish grammar or even pronunciation, and I did it. I only made it to about 1,000 words.
Right.
It just wasn't feasible to do 2,500 words in a week, but the result was not much. I mean, like I could read some, which was cool, but I completely wasn't able to speak or understand what anybody was saying. And I kind of after sort of that experience, I kind of started thinking about I sort of started trying to rethink like, okay, how am I gonna just learn a language from scratch? Like, what really is the best way? And I started thinking like, okay, I'm gonna give myself a challenge on YouTube to try to spend 30 days learning Spanish as good as I can, and I just started looking into it. I started trying to revise my process from scratch, and I was like, all right, I can't just use Anki. I'm not just going to read grammar books. Like, what am I going to do? And so I looked into a bunch of different things, and I think I found a really good way to do it, which I'll tell you in a second. But the first thing that I did was I actually got your course for learning Spanish, which I really, really liked. I didn't do the whole thing, but I did part of it.
That's awesome.
And I thought it was Spanish Uncovered, great course. And I spent a few days with that, just kind of get like a base in Spanish. But then I decided I was thinking, all right, look, I want to do a 5-day Spanish challenge and see how good I can get at speaking Spanish in 5 days. And so I thought, well, okay, if I'm going to really learn to speak Spanish, I got to just practice speaking a lot. So there's a do you know about Baselang?
Yep.
Yeah. So I signed up for Baselang, and I I basically just spent like doing pretty much nothing but speaking for a whole week, and
They must hate you for doing that.
right. I know. It's like the guy who goes to the
The
gym
guy who
for
breaks the
like
business.
30 bucks in a
Yeah.
month, who just goes every day for
Yeah.
like 10 hours. Yeah, so I've been doing that equivalent with Spanish for the past like month, and I haven't been using Anki or like grammar books or like other stuff, and um I've really liked it. You know, what I've realized is like the whole like Anki business of memorizing vocab. I think it's oversold. Like I feel like I feel like talking and reading is natural SRS. It's natural spaced repetition. Like I think the way that babies learn languages is not by memorizing vocab lists. It's by learning to talk, and it's by like, you know, stuff like what you do in your course where you just actually read stories and work through them, you know, in an open-ended way. Like it's not memorizing vocab. And if I had to redo my experience in China over, I think that I could have gotten so much more mileage by like I was spending literally hours on Anki per day. Like huge waste
So
of
you
time.
go all the way to China and then sit doing Anki whilst you're
Right. Why? Dude, no. Like, you gotta just spend your time, like, speaking with many people as possible. And obviously, like, I don't think that learning a language is just about learning to speak. Like, I think speaking is the most important thing in a language, but, like, you also do want to learn how to read, you know, you want to learn other stuff. But you can learn, like, reading. If you learn to speak first, you learn to read afterwards. That's a natural progression of language with humans in general, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been that there is probably more of a role for deliberate practice in Asian languages. I mean, obviously coming from a sort of native English perspective, there's slightly more of a role for deliberate practice in Asian languages than there is in a language with lots of cognates like Spanish, right? Because the distinction for me seems to be that with a language like Spanish, you can actually start speaking right from the beginning and learn as you go, because there are enough cognates and enough mutual understanding between the languages that if you're paying attention, you can actually learn from speaking. But if you try to do that with Mandarin or with Japanese at the beginning, you're like there's too much of a barrier. You've got to kind of
Right.
you've got to like pull yourself up a few notches before you can get access. Right. The same goes for reading. It's like there's a certain amount of you know, you're going to be forever reading at like 5% comprehension until you actually commit to memory a certain amount of key stuff. Although I absolutely agree with the you know, with the I don't know, I guess I have found I'm always kind of cautious of dismissing spaced repetition flashcards and stuff, because I have made extensive use of it myself as well, and I do it less and less. I don't really enjoy it much anymore, but I don't think the kind of input based philosophy of language learning is a complete panacea in the sense that like you just do that and that's enough. I think that the difference, and I remember talking with Matt from Matt versus Japan about this, the idea that look, that's going to get you most of the way, but then there is a huge role for deliberate practice in the sense that it can just speed things up a lot, you know, and it can just give your brain a little boost, because like you said, with reading you kind of get that natural repetition. SRS is a natural feature of reading, right? But that's not to say that that's working at the ideal rate, and that using things like spaced repetition you can just optimize a little bit more the amount that you're bringing back, like key vocabulary and stuff like that.
Yeah, you might be right. I mean, I think I kind of like the natural route, because I think one advantage that it gives you is it's almost like the free market of language learning, because I think I think that, so if you compare like a capitalist economy or a free market economy versus like a Soviet style planned economy, the reason why the capitalist economies work better is because all the individual actors know what they need to be. They have greater knowledge of what they're supposed to be doing than like that central planner, right? And
Yeah.
I think that in a similar way, like if you try to centrally plan what you're learning by like saying, okay, this week I am going to learn the 1,000 most frequent words in, Chinese, and then like in the next week I am going to memorize the top 100 grammar points that are most important in Chinese. I think that I think obviously there is a role for deliberate practice, especially in Asian languages, but I think that in when you're trying to naturally encounter as much stuff as possible, you're getting like a more natural frequency list of what's actually important. Like if you're going in your day, if you're living in Hong Kong and you're going in and you're going through the subway every day, you're reading the words on the, assuming you can understand the characters, like you're reading the words that you need to know in your daily life, and you learn like what's actually important, rather than what you might see in the textbook that you bought.
Yeah, a lot of that comes down to confidence and self-belief as well, doesn't it? Because I mean, I completely agree that like long term, when everything kind of evens out, like the guy who's spent his whole time reading and listening and speaking is going to be in a far better place than the guy or girl who's been
Right.
who's just been on Anki the whole time. That kind of stands to reason. But there's often, I mean, because in my work, I kind of spend a lot of time with a large number of people learning languages, of learners, self-directed learners.
Right.
And so often what you come up against is, it's like you can know that, you can be totally on board with this philosophy of a kind of holistic approach to language learning, but then struggle so much with the kind of execution of it in terms of just being motivated and self-disciplined enough to keep doing it, that can be enough to torpedo what you're trying to do. So you kind of got this, like, you've kind of got the ideal, and then you've got the question of what's going to keep you motivated enough on a daily basis to actually do the work. And that kind of leads you to the idea of the method that you follow is better than the mediocre method that you follow is better than the perfect method that you never do, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. And a lot of times people ask me like, wow, you're so good at Chinese, like how do I get good at Chinese like that? I'm like, all right, first of all,
block off the next 10 years.
Yeah, right. Okay. Like, first of all, do you have a really good reason for wanting to learn Chinese? They're like, well, because it looks cool in YouTube videos. I'm like, no. But like, do you live in China? Like, or like, do you have Chinese parents? Because there's a lot of Chinese Americans, for example, who don't speak Chinese very well and who want to learn Chinese. I'm like, talking with your grandparents in Chinese is a great reason to want to learn Chinese. But like, if it's just because it's cool, like, like I think for most people that's not a good enough reason to want to learn language. For me, to be honest, that's what it was. Like, yes, my reason for wanting to learn Chinese at the beginning was just because it was cool. And I have I think a very strong interest in languages and language learning and different cultures, and like I think you can see that on my YouTube channel. But like that's what it was at the beginning for me. But I think for most people it's not a good enough reason. And I think most people should just be content to say, like, you know what? Like, Chinese, that would be amazing if I learned to speak Chinese, but it's just like it would just take so much time to learn, and I don't have any Chinese relatives and I don't live in a Chinese speaking part of the world, that it's just not worth it. And I think it's a perfectly fine answer to the question of like, what do you actually
I agree. I think for most people, it's just not. I think most people go into language learning having no appreciation of just how much work it is to actually do it. I mean, you mentioned, like, the question of, do you live in China? I mean, you said you spent 1 year in China. What's kept you motivated enough to keep learning for the other? How many years have you been learning Chinese in total outside that 1 year in China?
I don't know, 10 years.
What's kept you motivated for those other 9 years when you weren't living there?
Well, I'm married to a Chinese woman.
That'll help.
Kind of helps, yeah. Right. So,
okay, you've answered my question.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's helpful. Also, obviously it's a great way to practice Chinese, but for me, to be honest, I actually don't find like that's a reason for me to not forget Chinese, but it's also a reason.
You'd be in a lot of trouble if you did.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. So, but I also don't think that it's like a sufficient way to practice. Because to be honest, I actually find that in most of my daily interactions with my wife, I don't really learn so much. It's very different from like deliberate practice. Like
Do you
I
speak
consider
Chinese together all the time?
yeah, well, it's about like 50%. She speaks good English, so we're like half Chinese, half English.
Okay.
So yeah, so you know, but I think that there's like for me, like I'm the equivalent of like in you know, we're in like in like if you're doing squats or something like that, like you're trying to you know increase your PRs every time. Like I'm not trying to do that, right? Like I'm in maintenance mode with Chinese, with the exception of like you know maybe I want to learn to speak Fujianese a bit better or Cantonese a bit better, but like you know I don't really necessarily feel the need to like learn so much more in Chinese apart from maybe reading, which I would like to get a little better at, but
Yeah. I think that's an
but
interesting. That whole topic is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about because I learned my languages mostly either by when I was a lot younger, just meeting a bunch of cool people from different places and being fascinated by them, or else
yeah
actually living in the country. These days, my life is pretty, straightforward. I live in North London with English around me all the time. I kind of, some of my languages are kind of falling away. Other ones I kind
yeah
of use fairly regularly, but I don't have any particular motivation to be cranking up the levels. So
yeah
it kind of makes me wonder, well, what's going to happen in the future? I don't know. Maybe maybe I'm just not going to be interested in language learning anymore. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen
yeah
in the future. It's a funny one,
yeah
isn't it? But I think it's a good place to be. Where you've learned a language to a point where it's become your life, and you're married to a Chinese girl, and
yeah
it is. I mean that's
yeah
the kind of point where the concept of language learning as a kind of shiny object ceases
right
to exist, right? It just becomes part of you, and
yeah
there'll come a point where you spent more of your life in Chinese than you have in English, which is probably
right.
not far off, right?
It actually isn't. Like I at this point I may have actually spent like I mean still probably more in English, but yeah, no, I've definitely spent equal part like a significant portion of my life in Chinese and using. I live in Chinatown too, so like I in New York City, so I go out and I buy stuff in Chinese. I talk to the shopkeepers in Chinese.
That's awesome.
I get my haircuts in Chinese, which right now obviously non-existent. But I get my nails done in Chinese. Like that's, and I think that's part of the attraction of my YouTube channel. It's interesting to see like, okay, well here's a non-Chinese American guy who like lives in Chinese. Like that's a huge part of my life. And obviously my wife and whatever, but like that's at home I speak Chinese all the time. Yeah, so but right it's for me it's not about language learning anymore. It's about like this is a part of who I am. It's like another soul that I have. And like one thing I'm thinking about with Spanish is I mean I really like this language, and I want to keep learning and I want to get good at it.
It's a good language to have in New York as well, right?
Oh yeah, I mean there's so many people who on my street even there's tons of people who speak Spanish, and I'm trying to think of ways to integrate that more directly into my life so that I have more motivation to keep learning.
It's been so much fun. Thanks for taking the time, man.
Likewise, man.
We could keep talking for a long time. I had a whole index card with questions I wanted to ask you. I think I've asked you literally none of them. So I'll save those for round two. And good luck with your Spanish and all your other endeavors. Where would you like to send people to find out more about you?
I mean, they can just check out my YouTube channel at Xiaoma NYC. If you just do it,
spell that for us, please.
It's like Xiaomanyc, or if you just do like a YouTube or Google search for white guy speaks Chinese, like you'll find my channel as well.
The top 20 search results.
Yeah, and then on Instagram and Facebook as well.
Awesome. All right, man. Take care. Good luck for the. Stay safe in current crazy times, and maybe if you find a good way to get a haircut, let me know because I'm in the same boat.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Take care.
Well, thanks so much, Ollie.